Hello and welcome to Psyched, the show where we explore psychedelics through social, economic, and political perspectives. Our next speaker, we have Colin Pugh. He'll be talking on psychedelics and contemplative spirituality, how the psychedelic experience can be understood in the context of contemplative spiritual practice. Colin is the president of the Brooklyn Psychedelic Society, a community that supports individuals who are pursuing transformative psychedelic experiences. Colin, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Psyched.
Thanks for having me, Merrick. Happy to be here at Psyched. Can you guys hear me okay?
You're pretty quiet. We can hear you a tiny bit.
Does it sound any better?
Maybe a little bit, but still quite quiet.
Wait, you know what? Let me try this. Any better?
Yep, that's really good.
All right, cool. Let's put the different headphones in. All right, can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're good.
Thanks for having me, guys. Happy to be here, Merrick. Hope your conference is going well so far. So I've been organizing the Brooklyn Psychedelic Society for about 4 years now, and I've had a lot of interesting experiences, both with psychedelics and also kind of spiritual practices and identities. So I kind of wanted to share with the Psyched conference just some conclusions and thoughts I've had after 4 or 5 years in the psychedelic scene of how psychedelics and what I'm terming contemplative spirituality interface. So first of all, what is contemplative spirituality versus just spirituality in and of itself? So quite often we hear a lot of people in the psychedelic scene either don't identify with a particular religious tradition or spiritual tradition, but may or may not call themselves spiritual but not religious. And colloquially, the term spiritual has kind of come to mean just, I think, an emphasis on experience of transcendence or experience of emptiness from an Eastern perspective, or just basically the experiential side to religious perspectives that have kind of been overshadowed or even shunned in traditional religious traditions. So spirituality is a pretty big component of the psychedelic experience. Usually I think people agree there's 3 general levels of the psychedelic experience that are not hard delineating lines, but are the recreational, aesthetic, psychological, and kind of spiritual, kind of each at corresponding higher doses. So given that kind of colloquial definition of the word, spirituality is like the experiential side of religion or just experience of the transcendent or emptiness. What is contemplative spirituality? So contemplative is kind of comes from a more like Christian Western tradition, but in the contemplative spiritual scene outside of the psychedelic scene, contemplative just in general means a kind of slightly more sustained, serious engagement with the spiritual practices that one is taking on for themselves. And the reason that contemplative spirituality is a useful phrase compared to just spirituality in and of itself is spirituality inside of a society heavily saturated in just kind of capitalism or a lot of perhaps like vices and things like that that might kind of easily trap you or kind of just keep you sucked into maybe not the best way a human being could live. Just when we live in basically a very self-centered sort of like saturated society, spirituality is very easily kind of subsumed underneath those kind of cultural mores and ideals. And so contemplative spirituality is kind of an emerging phrase people are using in like the both the psychedelic scene and the contemplative spirituality scene to just highlight kind of difference of kind of attitude and seriousness with with spiritual practice. So contemplative means like thought out or kind of intellectual a little bit, but it kind of just means a more sustained, serious, thoughtful engagement with the spiritual practices one is engaging in. So how the heck does this relate to our favorite topic du jour, psychedelics, here at Psyched 2020? Well, guys, luckily, your boy Colin has all the answers. So what do psychedelics do? So well, first, actually, let me give like how traditional religious views kind of see what salvation is, or kind of like the point of walking those paths, and how like psychedelics kind of fit in with that. So with Buddhism, a lot of it, I mean, I'm grossly oversimplifying these multi-thousand-year traditions here, but in religious studies, there's this term called soteriology, which is like the study of salvation for each kind of religious path. And that's kind of the path one would walk to be liberated in whatever religious domain you're talking about. So in Buddhism, it's seen through illusion, realizing one's inner nature as a Buddha or emptiness. One of the first of the Four Noble Truths is that life is suffering, which is also called dukkha. Duhkka, I believe it's spelled, which translates to suffering. In Pali, it also kind of has connotations of like a wheel that's like off axle. So life is kind of a wheel that's off axle in one framing of Buddhism, generally construed. So if you think about like life kind of feeling like that, like, you know, axle is the wheel's moving, is working, but something kind of feels slightly off, like something's a little weird, a little funky. But we keep on trucking, hence the wheel metaphor. It ties in perfectly with the truck metaphor. They keep on trucking, keep on going. Something feels a little off. So that's kind of, so Buddhism prescribes some forms of the Eightfold Noble Path are like these ways to realize what's causing all this craving and suffering, and to get that axle like clicked into place. In Christianity, it's called like original sin, or also original imperfection. Sin is sometimes seen as something morally bad or to be guilty about, but a more contemplative view of what original sin is kind of more in line with a Buddhist perspective, is that it's just moving away from this boundless, infinite source of non-coercive love, which is God. And a quote from Augustine, for instance, is our hearts are restless until it rests in you. So I guess one salvation path of Christianity, soteriological understanding of Christianity, is that we have like a heart, infinite heart capable of infinite love, but we're constantly trying to satisfy it with uninfinite things, and only like infinite love can fill that. But the idea is that we have the image of God in us, but don't act like God. Like we have the capability of acting like sons and daughters and children of God on earth, but we have something in the way, in a simple way that might be like the ego in like a psychedelic paradigm sense. And even in secular kind of terms like philosophical ethics, there's virtue ethics, which is kind of similar to, which is kind of a secular version of Buddhist or Christian soteriological paths, where acting in accordance with virtue will produce human flourishing. So anyways, these are kind of three general overviews of three different systems of liberation paths. And why these are important is because I think psychedelics can help both initiate an awareness that these sorts of paths exist, like ontologically, or just kind of are things that can be walked on Earth and in our experience. And they can also help actually walk the paths themselves. But I think there's actually some kind of pitfalls that psychedelic experience, absent of some sort of spiritual framework, contemplative spiritual framework, whether it is theistic or non-theistic like Buddhist, or even if it's secular, but having some sort of framework is helpful for the psychedelic experience producing the most fruits. So a kind of simply psychedelic kind of paradigm for understanding salvation, which is pretty common in the psychedelic scene, just from my own experience. I'm not saying this is it, but it's kind of a trauma-centric view on what's causing us to be unliberated or have suffering, is that we have trauma from childhood, from birth, or even from perhaps past lives. And the psychedelic work allows us to work through these traumas and energetically free ourselves, which I think is true to a degree and mirrors very closely a lot of religious traditions, salvation paths. But I think one of the main issues that the psychedelic scene is lacking, where I think contemplative spirituality can help, is that absent of some sort of kind of ideological scaffolding to contextualize trauma within, such as the Buddhism Four Noble Truths, or Christianity's original imperfection of being separate from God. If there's not some kind of ideological framework for understanding the bigger picture that trauma sits within, I think there is a risk in the psychedelic soteriological framing of the world that can blanket everything in terms of trauma and misses out on things like beauty, joy, goodness, love, lightness. So anyways, that's kind of a general quick intro to kind of the framing I'm thinking of salvatory paths, and the salvatory paths of Buddhism, Christianity, secular ethics, and also sort of psychedelics in and of itself. So one of the pitfalls, I think, was these things called epiphany loops that I talk about with like people who are benefiting from psychedelic experience, like with LSD or ayahuasca, but lacking some sort of helpful framework for them to integrate those insights into their daily life. They can sometimes get caught in what I call epiphany loops, where they keep having to go back to the psychedelic experience to kind of get another afterglow that hopefully carries over into daily life. But I think kind of people get caught in this like loop. On the other side, people who are more religious or spiritual but never have had a psychedelic experience or a mystical experience have maybe the daily practice down, like a daily meditation down, or going to do charity work somewhere, or like volunteering or going to church, or some daily sober sort of commitment to something. But they often kind of like stay at like a certain level of awareness of things, either whether that's social injustice or ecological problems that our species and world is going through currently. So a helpful term for understanding, or helpful concept for how psychedelics fit into contemplative spirituality and how contemplative spirituality fits into psychedelic experience, is this idea called like waking up versus growing up. This is like a phrase taken from this 90s thinker called Ken Wilber, who probably many of you have heard of. It's pretty popular. He's also very popular in like contemplative spiritual kind of milieus and whatnot. So waking up is when you like see that there's like a possible, not only possibility for yourself as an individual, like what kind of fully blossomed person you can be, but what kind of like world we can have. So that's waking up. But then growing up is then actually doing the work to get to that kind of place of equanimity, maturity, calmness, intellectual, artistic, creative, character, maturity, and whatnot. So growing up is actually doing the work to gradually unpack these sorts of obfuscations of that fully blossomed version of yourself and of the world, that a powerful, beneficial psychedelic experience like an ego death or something like that can sort of instill in someone. So while psychedelics have traditionally, like in the 60s, been understood as tools for helping people wake up, where the psychedelic scene, in my opinion, is kind of lacking is integrating and interfacing with the spiritual traditions, because I think those spiritual traditions provide healthy frameworks for actually growing up. So, for instance, how a psychedelic such, or like an entheogen, that's probably a better phrase for this one, for like ayahuasca, for instance, taking the contemplative Christian view of like how salvation works, is the idea is that God planted like a shard of his love inside of us. So we have the image of God blueprinted within us, but then we don't actually necessarily like live like God intends, like very loving, selfless, giving, serving other people, etc. And the idea is that, for instance, Jesus spent 40 days in the desert and Buddha meditated for 40 days. They all went through this kind of path of growing up themselves, of having to go through temptations and confronting kind of energetic blockages that they had, even as impressive spiritual seekers or sons of God or whatever you might believe. So I think psychedelics are beneficial because I think I'm kind of repeating myself, I guess, but yeah, I think where contemplative spirituality or contemplative spiritual frameworks can help inform a lot of people in the psychedelic scene is they can act as the sort of trellis or the kind of scaffolding for growing up, that I think absent of some honest kind of theorizing about like why we're actually doing psychedelics or what impact these things have on the world, or our practice has on the world, we're not going to actually kind of inculcate and mature those insights. So some like very general, basic sort of contemplative spiritual suggestions that are helpful to the psychedelic practitioner is things like having like a regular spiritual practice, perhaps having like a therapist, having some sort of like religious commitments or identity, such as contemplative Catholic, Buddhist, or like secular humanism, but just something to kind of check against yourself, some sort of like coherent framework that makes those mystical, less intellectual experiences that we have actually be able to be formed and shaped into some sort of better version of us and our society. Because mysticism absent of some sort of structure will just kind of get caught in a loop. So yeah, that's kind of my short talk. Hope I can keep going. I guess I have like 5 more minutes, but I could do we do questions now or something?
Hey, Colin, thanks for
Hey,
that.
no problem. A little jumbled. Hope it kind of cohered.
No, it was great. I'd love to start off with asking about structure.
Yeah.
Outside of, in many ways, psychedelics kind of collapse the structures that we currently have. What do you feel like makes, spiritual structures, I guess, more resilient to that collapse? Or do you think that that's just kind of us being more set on them? But yeah, would really love to hear about, I guess, the resiliency of spiritual structures to the collapse that psychedelics tend to bring on.
Sure, that's a good question. I think their resiliency is that they can kind of help categorize or make sense of what sorts of changes the individual is going through that can give them a little more like runway. I think spiritual structures are actually kind of lacking. I think some spiritual structures, is like initiation rites, which is more common, like indigenous cultures, actually encourage a collapse of the self or the identity. So I think couching these sorts of beneficial collapses that psychedelics can engender in a person, having some sort of ritualistic context can actually both make it more kind of safe because the person has like context to understand it in, both physically but also ideologically. If there's some kind of philosophical system that gives it a little more context, they can like bring it more into the daily life, I think. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
Well, extending off of it, in the integration process after we have a psychedelic experience, what is the, I guess, balance of pushing back on a structure, even a spiritual structure that maybe we've adopted, and kind of just allowing for it to inform our lives? Should we be feeling a constant resistance to it, or at least a questioning of it? Or should we kind of allow for ourselves to lean into it and really just allow for it to kind of guide us forward? Or maybe there's no right option. I don't know. Just wanted to hear.
Yeah, I don't think I would be qualified or to say. You're asking how would I personally suggest someone balancing oscillating between, what were you saying?
Yeah, or even in your personal experience, your personal practice, I guess, like, what's the balance of taking a structure, a spiritual structure that maybe we're adopting, and
Hmm.
pushing against it and allowing for ourselves to question it, or just, kind of accepting it and allowing for it to guide us?
I think the person has to really reflect on themselves and discern for themselves what they're really doing, and being clear with that. And I think if people really just take some time to get some inner quietness, they will be able to discern if kind of following the structure is a calling of their sort of higher self or more flourishing version of themselves, or if they are actually running away from growth. I think that's where having some sort of spiritual director is key, um, to helping make that discernment. Because if some system or rule is saying you actually shouldn't be doing that, I think there's a lot of pushback from that, understandably, in the psychedelic scene. I think because I think a lot of people have trauma from religious systems. Um, I don't know if I'd say I had trauma, but I like was raised Christian, then was atheist for a while, then came back into it in a certain way, but with this mystical take on it. So I think this involves listening to your heart, discernment, I would say, and having someone who's walked a similar path with or without psychedelics, uh, is very helpful for that process, in my opinion.
Hmm. And with spirituality, this kind of connection to something outside of ourselves, and then religiosity, practice of habit building. In many ways, it feels like integration. At least the language around it in the psychedelic space is actually, in some ways, more religious than it is spiritual. It's the building of habits, integrating into our day-to-day lives. Where do you feel that, like, I guess, these habits, these practices, these kind of religious rituals play in at the intersection of these spiritual models?
Um, I'm not sure I understand the last part of your question. Can you repeat it? Sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
how does, I guess, integration,
Hmm.
and possibly integration that stems from religious practice, overlap or somehow intersect with the spiritual models that you speak about?
Well, I think religion is integration. I think we've been doing religion from the bottom up with psychedelics. Like we start with the mystical experience, and then people start to try to codify those insights. Um, and I think religion is like the domain of human experience that kind of leads to our transformation. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be Christian or Buddhist or something, but any sort of ideological system that a person finds suited to their temperament and challenging enough to help them mature, and then a earnest attempt at going through that system's kind of crucible is what I think, integration is. I think a lot of people actually get stuck sometimes with the psychedelic experience because they'll understand that, like, yes, everything is love, like they're definitely not wrong, everything is love and light, but how does that actually like look in the world? I think MLK said like just is what like love looks like in practice or something. And for me personally, I think religious philosophical systems have a much better understanding of how those sorts of experience actually, uh, are meant to be permeated on earth, in my opinion.
Hmm. In a more secular society, you had a lot of experience with the Brooklyn Psychedelic Society. Would really love to hear, what are those religious practices? Is that, is that the integration circles? Is that meditation? Is that going to Soul Cycle with a bunch of folks? What does that look like?
Definitely not Soul Cycle. I know that's what it doesn't look like. uh, no, no harm to souls. I've never been there. I know people might want it, but what does what look like? You're saying? How does?
Does this religious practice manifest in, I guess, more secular society?
Yeah, I think it does. Well, I'm defining religion broadly construed as like the sets. Like I think like Western philosophy is a sort of religion. Like Plato's allegory of the cave says that we're kind of have an obscured view of things, but if we like work to understand through knowledge what's obscuring our view, we can see the sun. Like that is a soteriological point of view, that there is we have an illusion and there is a method to clearing that illusion up, and there's a result after that illusion is cleared. So I think religious, I think we're wired to be religious. I just think a lot of things, even if you think of like Marxism or something, um it has a certain worldview, it has a certain view of like historical materialism, or how those things sort of interact with the individual, and how we're like really a creative species, and like that's been kind of sapped from commodification, idolization, and whatnot. So religion, I think, has traditionally been understood as like a pacifying or an opiate kind of force, but I think at its true levels, what really is like it's about transformation. That's why I don't think religion's ever going to go away, at least if it's defined how I'm defining it, like the sets of human symbols, practices, rituals, ceremonies, and texts that lead to humans' transformation in their most flourishing versions of themselves.
Mhm. Uh, Most of our conversation right now has been kind of on an internal focus, or maybe, communities that align on the same practices. I'm looking at your wall. I see this dinosaur in a glass jar. I'm also
There
thinking
is.
of, yeah, for some reason
Is
it
there a
conjured.
problem that we have with
Well,
that?
it conjured up this memory of a lot of discussions in high school. I like worked in interfaith a lot, and lived in a very kind of interreligious community. And one of the biggest debates we ever had was like the spaghetti monster of a very like kind of like a comedic religion. I don't know if you've heard of this or
Yeah,
yeah. So I don't remember the name of the religion. Don't really yeah. But basically,
Cult
this
of the
like
Flying Spaghetti Monster, I think.
yeah, something like
Yeah.
this. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, we have our
Is it
own
true?
spirituality, our own
Yeah.
religious practices. How do we
Mm.
actually engage with other, sorry, I'm just getting comments here. How do we engage with other people's religious practices in regards to, either questioning them or learning
Mhm.
from them? What's the best way that we can find balance there as well?
I think the best way we can find balance is both by understanding religion theoretically and practicing it personally, and being able to oscillate between those two. If we understand religion as the sets of practices that both unite a community and also annihilate the person in a way, and the more mature levels lead to its transformation. If we understand religion is that, but also that we ourselves as individuals and as a community have to take a leap into whatever sort of symbols lead to that for us. I think that's how interfaith understanding can best be facilitated. It's kind of a contemplative, mystical, spiritual understanding of what religion is supposed to be doing, which is a certain premise, I guess. But yeah, oscillating between an objective theoretical understanding of religion and a personal subjective undertaking of it, I would say.
Hmm. There was a conversation I had with an individual
Get out.
a few, a few weeks back that was basically talking about how they choose to only do psychedelic experiences with individuals who don't necessarily have strong ideas of religiosity, that they, have been harmed by that type of thought, and they feel that
Yeah.
that type of thought can really affect them as well through that, more sensitive state. What are
Hmm.
your thoughts on something like that? Do you feel like we should be, really careful of who we trip with, not only in regards to whether they're safe physically, but also whether they have opinions or belief systems that might affect us in a way that we don't want to be influenced?
I would say if someone I think it's always important to be respectful to the dignity of people's conscience and where they're at. And if someone is expressing uncomfortability with tripping due to someone else having religiosity, I absolutely would suggest they trip with someone or that makes them not have that uncomfortability. At the same time, I think that with enough psychedelic work, or also just spiritual practice and prayer and works of mercy and charity and whatnot, I think the need to have more and more safeguards becomes less and less necessary, because you start to see how life is sort of imbued with this loving kind of force or something. I'm kind of getting off, but I would suggest people do what's right for them at the time, but also understand that maybe eventually they can like ease those up. If someone has traumatic upbringing with the religious, even the word religion, which causes a lot of trauma for people, I totally understand and would respect that and encourage them to not do something that feels unnatural. Yeah.
Definitely.
And that's just like basic 101, I think, Merrick.
Yeah.
That's what I would say. Can't believe you had to ask me that. Just kidding. Really? I'm just kidding. That's a good question.
Colin, well, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your insights, answering all the questions. And yeah, looking forward to talking more later.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, man.
Appreciate it, Merrick. Take it easy, guys.